Welcome everyone to our final conversation with the candidates. I'm Tim Lana, I'm Vice Chair of Zero Carbon Harrogate. This is Jemima Parker, who chairs the organisation, and it's great to have Tom Gorton, a candidate for the Liberal Democrat Party, with us today. So, Tom, introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure, yeah. So I was going to say, I think I'll start with sort of a bit of a background first in terms of where I've come from, where I hope to be going. So I'm originally from Nottingley, so just down the A1, born and raised in Yorkshire. So grew up in an ex-mining town that had coal-fired power stations, 3 glass factories, suffered quite a bit of post-industrial decline. My mum raised me there as a single parent, and I was the first person in my family to go to university and went up to Newcastle, where I did my first degree in biochemistry, so I'm technically a scientist, and then sort of segued into public health and did my master's in that. The reason I actually got involved in politics was the day before I started my master's degree, my mum was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I'd always sort of been brought up expecting that when things go wrong, there's a bit of a safety net there and the state sort of helps. The lived experience that we had was quite something different. So she was working a minimum wage job for a national retailer, and effectively, for all intents and purposes, when she was diagnosed with cancer, she had to have a left side mastectomy, needed 6 weeks off work to recover from the surgery. Her employer said you can have 2 weeks off full pay. After that, it's then statutory sick. Well, trying to pay the mortgage, keep the lights on, put food on the table, and at the time my little sister would have been 5 as well, so to try to keep the family going just was impossible. We ended up in a situation where I dropped down, did my degree over 2 years, my master's, to help out at home as much as I could and help look after my mum and my little sister. But it was sort of quite a protracted thing. She ended up needing 6 months of chemotherapy and would effectively have her chemotherapy on a Friday night, so she could be sick over the weekend to be back at work on a Monday. And that entire experience sort of made me sort of think, well, what on earth has gone wrong? We're meant to live in one of the richest countries in the world. We're always told that if you need help, it's there and we'll support people in their time of need. But the sort of stark reality on the ground is that just doesn't happen much anymore. So that's what motivated me to get involved and want to change things.
Indeed. That's quite a severe experience.
Yeah.
And quite a responsibility.
If that doesn't politicise you, I'm not sure what will.
Fairly tender age to take on that responsibility.
Yeah. And then after that, I sort of, after my degree, took a job at the University of York as a health economist, and then segued into politics. And then sort of what I do for the day job now is a policy role for a health charity, JDRF, for type 1 diabetes charity. Prior to that, I worked for the Carers Trust as well in a similar policy role.
Right.
So a bit of a broad spread of interests.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So how did that, had you come from a family where politics was discussed a lot, or had you formed views about, where on the political spectrum you identified?
Oh, not at all. I don't think politics was something that was really talked about when we was growing up. The area that I was from was a safe Labour area, and it was just sort of, that's how it votes, that's what happens here. I only really started, like I say, questioning politics when I got a bit older, wondering why decisions that were taken were made. When I was at university, the area that I was in sort of switched between Labour and Liberal Democrats. Again, I wasn't overly involved. I don't think many university students are too involved in local elections and politics, and I certainly wasn't. I did actually end up with an internship in the House of Lords, which is a real odd story. So it was 2014, I was on my way to London for a friend's birthday over one of the summer breaks, and met a little lady who sat on the train opposite me, and noticed that she had a little diary, what said House of Lords on the side. And sort of after sitting there, I was reading Game of Thrones at the time as well. I can remember sort of had my headphones in and was sort of like been a little bit nosy and sort of like trying to sort of and then after about 5-10 minutes of sort of deciding whether or not I could speak to this lady who presumably was a peer, and she was indeed, I was like, oh, hi, my name's Tom. I can see you've got a little diary that says House of Lords on the side. Are you like a peer, or can I speak to you? She sort of looked at me quite strange and was like, yes, of course you can speak to me. And struck up a conversation on the train on the way to London, and effectively by the end of it, she was like, here's my business card, if there's anything I can help with, just let me know. Then about 3-4 hours later, I thought, I'll drop her an email and say, can I have an internship over the summer in the House of Lords? And that happened.
So
and
who was she?
She was a lady called Angela Harris of Richmond, North Yorkshire.
Right.
She's a Liberal Democrat, but this was way before I got involved with the Lib Dems, or like years before I joined or got involved in politics.
Right.
So it just goes to show, if you use public transport, you don't know who you meet.
Indeed. Always talk to strangers on public transport. It's actually one of Michael Mosley's things to help you make you happier, talking to strangers. Top tip. Yeah.
Very good. So was it through that you realised that you would be most at home in the
Not really. I mean, if we're being quite sort of frank, I was a first year of university students to end up with the raised fees. And in 2010, whilst I wasn't old enough to vote, I did apparently get my mum to go out and vote Lib Dem. And then I think it's probably fair to say, like many people of that sort of age range, were somewhat disappointed in the party for breaking that promise. It's sort of quite ironic in a way, because I pay less back now under the current scheme than I would have done under the previous one, swings and roundabouts. But I don't think that was a point. So that coalition and the deal breaking on the university fees is sort of, I think, made a lot of people of similar age to me be a bit disengaged with politics.
Yeah.
And what was quite interesting is on that train conversation with Angela Harris, she was like, I will never forgive that man, meaning Nick Clegg. And I was like, oh, okay, so not everyone has to be all happy-go-lucky all the time and on board with everything that a political party does.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, I didn't really join the Lib Dems until, I think it was 2017. And that was, again, like I say, after the experience of sort of doing my master's degree, and my mum, I thought, this is a party that sort of more reflects my values and views, and it sort of comes down to me, sort of fairness and trying to have a, quite pragmatic approach to how we solve the problems that we've got. And, broadly speaking, if there's a question that you don't know the answer to and you're a Lib Dem, you normally just go with common sense and a bit of evidence-based policy, and that's usually what the approach that we will be advocating for is.
So did you then get involved in local politics, in council politics?
So when I was finishing my master's degree off, I ended up elected for a year at the council up there. And then when I moved back home, I did sort of got involved in local politics too. And it just sort of all escalates. I think what I would say about political parties is, if you're relatively eager and keen, people will snap your hand off and give you the opportunities to go forth and have a bit of a crack at it. And I think that's really good, because we need people from all different walks of backgrounds of life and age and demographics to be involved. And I think, I've always, whenever I've looked at Parliament or a council or whatever level of government it might be, I've always thought that doesn't look like me, it doesn't talk like me, it doesn't address the issues that I see. And I think there's lots of young people in particular out there who feel like that about politics, that they don't think it's adequately addressing the concerns that they have.
Yeah. So did you serve as a local councillor?
Yeah. So like I said, I did 1 year when I was at university, and then
I was thinking back in.
And then back, So I was elected in 2019, and was the first and only Lib Dem in like the best part of a decade to be elected to work for the council.
Right.
And again, I think that was a bit of a shock to quite a lot of people, quite unexpected. It was one of the safest seats in the council, where I'd sort of been born, raised and went to school. And we went from not having one to winning with 63% of the vote. So underestimate me at your peril, political opponents. And again, I think, I think sometimes people overthink politics. I think they, start thinking, is it all about policy? Is it all about sort of data? And in truth, it's about conversations and people. It's about speaking to people and listening more than talking at people.
Right.
And over the last, 18 months here, since I was selected as a candidate, we've knocked on countless doors, had countless conversations, and it's, making sure that politics is an all year round event, not just at election time.
Right. So this is your first time as a candidate in the general election, then?
No, I stood in 2019 in Northampton, Pontefract and Castleford against Yvette Cooper. The party always wants people to stand, and even where we don't think we've got a credible chance of winning, political parties exist to stand and contest and hold to account the people that they stand against. So that was quite an experience. I think having, then, was she the chair of one of the committees at that point rather than Home Secretary? Yeah, so she's quite key on detail and quite an eye for a grilling, is that.
Yeah.
So that was certainly an experience. But yeah, I mean, it's been a bit of a whirlwind, really, because I didn't necessarily expect to win the selection here. did, and then sort of rest is sort of
Yeah. And
Let's
you've
be
lived here
honest.
now for what, 18?
yeah,
2 years?
So yeah, back end it would have been nearly best part of 2 years, 18 months.
Yeah. Excellent. Oh, thank you for that colourful
Brief,
picture.
yeah.
Whistle stop tour
Yeah.
of your life.
And just to thread through that then, Tom, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your journey in terms of climate awareness. And clearly, you understandably, you have a very strong passion for healthcare. But in terms of climate change, how did you become more aware about that and the issues involved?
I think I've always been sort of somewhat climate conscious. It's been obviously one of the issues that in recent years has become more prevalent and more topical, and people are now actually starting to see and realise that with the effects of climate change that we're already experiencing, it's not some distant, far off problem anymore. It's something that people are grappling with. Even in places like the UK, but certainly further afield, where we're seeing droughts, famine, floods, you name it. I mean, when you grow up sort of under the shadow of a coal-fired power station, that does make you start thinking about what's that, why is it there, what other alternatives are there. I can remember as a kid, well, even though it was only a couple of years ago, wasn't it, when they demolished that, and there was an application that was put in by Rolls-Royce looking at it as one of the potential sites for the mini modular nuclear reactors, and sort of always had that on the doorstep, thinking about how we produce energy and why we consume it. So it's always been something that's been quite prominent in life. And I suppose I can remember when I was at university, the other thing that makes you start wondering about certainly the energy consumption side of things is when you start paying your own bills for electric. And you start realising just how volatile the markets are, and if you leave the heating on overnight, you'll won't do that one twice, will you? Not when you're a university student. But yeah, I mean, it's quite an interesting one, isn't it? I think there's still I don't know why there isn't necessarily so much of a focus on climate change. I think it's because people just sort of wish that it isn't happening. But it's quite good to see that it's becoming more prolific and something that's talked about. Although there's obviously a lot more to do on that front.
Mm-hmm. And bringing it down to local, what would you see are the key areas that we need to decarbonise within this constituency? I was going to say, what would you?
I mean, the main ones that everyone obviously always talks about is the traffic and the congestion around town. It's the most visible one, I'd say, as well. I think it's been a bit of a disappointment and failure of both Harrogate Borough Council and North Yorkshire County as they were, and now the new North Yorkshire Council. There's not been a proper, well thought through integrated transport plan looking at how we try to get people to move around town, whether that be by foot, by bike, or by public transport. Or, some people do still need to use cars if they've got journeys that are further afield, but they can't get public transport to, or if they're a bit sort of removed off grid. So I think, trying to make sure that there's a comprehensive plan and strategy that actually deals with that. And what we have seen in recent years is the approach from national government is, you need to put together a business case for this isolated single pot of money that won't necessarily fit into a wider view of what is needed in town. So I think that's certainly one of the sort of more prominent sort of features that you see when you sort of go about town is just the volume of traffic and the impact that obviously has on air quality and the environment too.
Thank you. And as I said, Joe, we started on transport, so let's keep going on transport for now. In terms of policies, look at the Liberal Democrats' policy manifesto. It talks about restoring the electric car. No
incentives.
Thank you. Yes, incentives,
Yeah.
and no new fossil fuel cars beyond 2030. Yeah. Again, just bringing that locally. I mean, Harrogate has a much higher uptake of electric vehicles than other areas. I was going to say, would that be a key thing that you would be pushing, or?
I think, again, part of what's needed to further incentivise people is obviously people who are on lower incomes sort of help to get an electric vehicle, obviously still quite considerably pricier than the alternative. But it's also about trying to get people out of cars onto public transport too. And whilst we, broadly speaking, have a goodish bus service, hearing complaints about reliability is certainly something that seems to be happening more. And also when it comes to trains as well, the issue that we've seen with sort of Northern Rail or TransPennine, for anyone who might be commuting through to Manchester over the last year or so, has been pretty dreadful. So I think sort of trying to embed key critical infrastructure for electric vehicles is key, but also trying to not just rely on getting everyone to transition to electric vehicles, but other methods of transport too. We know we want to see a rapid rollout of more EV charging points, and I think there's still a bit of work to be done around how you install or make provision for such things in areas that not everyone has their own driveway, a decent number of terrace houses. How do you then factor and fit and retrofit all that in? There's some novel ideas out there, but by no means a proper one-size-fits-all answer for these sort of things.
Yeah. And it was good to see you at the bus launch.
Yes.
Last week. We had that thrown in for a bit of fun last week, didn't we? A very spectacular event with our all electric buses from Transdev going all electric. So, in terms of reliability and how would you seek to improve that? What would you actually do with the buses? Because I was going to say we are going to have an all-electric fleet. So can we do better than that?
I mean, obviously it's something that's sort of a natural progression anyway. The bus companies obviously, want to generate profit and revenue, and that relies on them having a reliable service. That's broadly speaking quite frequent too. Obviously, it's not a overnight fix. What they were talking about in terms of being able to quick charge at Harrogate bus station rather than having to go back to the depot is quite key. But again, I think it's more about making sure that there are routes that accommodate everyone. I know there's been some rejigging of bus routes previously, sort of up around Bilton, which has caused issue for people up there. But also making sure that we don't just focus on towns and when it comes to buses, making sure we've got rural buses and bus routes too. They always seem to be the first ones to be cut. And the ones which are a bit of a lifeline for people. So making sure that we've got that frequency, that reliability, and the actual spread of service is what we need to do. Obviously, the government has been capping bus fares, which has been good and helps a lot of people with the cost of living. What will happen with the next government, whoever that might be, is obviously still a question for the future that no one knows the answer to yet.
Would you seek to sort of reallocate the capacity that we've got, in terms of more space for cycle lanes and for bus lanes, and because in a sense it's a push and a pull working together.
No, absolutely. Just one thing before I come on to that is just the bus franchising. So one of the things that we've said is we want to see powers given to mayors, and obviously that's something that I know that they were looking at already. But just actually seeking to make sure that the local authorities, or the combined authority in this case, are the ones driving that forward rather than relying on a market. Buses are obviously heavily subsidised across the board, and that's how we make it competitive and attractive for people to use.
Right.
So I think that's quite key. I think on the reallocation of sort of space, to me, certainly with cycle lanes, when I was at university, I was knocked off my bike, was cycling around the corner over a bridge. Someone came at speed, there was a sort of traffic islands there to go around, clipped me off and then drove off. Fortunately, I'm fine and I'm still here. I was not particularly well after, effectively sort of had a bit of cuts and bruises. But for me, I tend to, if I go abroad, I will cycle abroad because they have better infrastructure. They have segregated cycle lanes usually, and it's just a more pleasant and enjoyable experience where you don't feel threatened or unsafe by road users. So to me, it's not necessarily about, and this is sort of the hesitancy I have, is that most of the cycle schemes or plans seem to be, let's just put some paint down on a road or put down some sort of slight segregation, but not really. And that's not the key for a lot of people. That doesn't stop people feeling threatened or, run off the road by people in 4x4s. And again, I think it's about trying to think creatively to make sure we have cycle schemes that are fit for purpose, because I think one of the biggest barriers locally to what we've seen of further expansion of cycleways and active travel has been the Otley Road scheme, which it doesn't matter whether you're a cyclist, a pedestrian, a car user, I'm pretty sure everyone's pretty unhappy with that scheme. So trying to make sure we get it right first time, and then it is used, and then people see the benefits of it, rather than just, countless millions of pounds squandered. And that, again, is a sort of thing, one of the biggest sort of barriers to having further active travel in the town is the fact that when we've had it previously, it's been done so badly. And the same can be said with the station gateway consultation, the multiple rounds of that, the watering down, the backpedalling, the sort of, it's sort of managed to work everyone, I think is probably the fairest way to describe it. And, that's a loss to everyone, because actually what we should have been having is a scheme that wasn't just dealing with, a few 100 metre stretch of road, but was actually going to be part of something bigger. And when you think about the sort of over £10 million of funding, we should have been getting more than just a short track. We should have been talking about how we make a broad integrated transport plan that links key areas that people use. And that's a bit of a failure of the council.
So, just finishing off on transport, it's interesting to see in the manifesto that there's a line, sorry, forgive me if I'm not trying to catch you out on the manifesto, but just interesting to see that there's a line about having aviation fuel decarbonising and actually trying to switch to lower carbon aviation fuels, but also a line about trying encouraging people to take fewer flights.
Yes.
And I wondered if you had any comments on how you would do that, because I think this is where the challenge.
Yeah, this is where the question where we had at the hustings, where you sort of yes or no people into would you tax people out of flying? And I think it's a sort of like I say, it's a two-way thing. You've got to give and take. And I think what we do see is for journeys like if you were, for instance, looking at flights from Manchester to London, there's no real good reason that those flights should exist. We should be having actual rail capacity and infrastructure built there to facilitate that. What we have seen is with HS2 an absolute shambles of how not to do major infrastructure projects. I do think there is a hesitancy with the UK government to actually invest in big projects because they always end up overrunning, they always end up over budget, and then everyone ends up unhappy. I think that's a failure of the government to invest in skills, invest in training, and have professional project management teams that can deal with projects not just once every 20, 30 years, which is why you don't have those skills, because there's not a proper market there for them. And this sort of reliance on contractors who seem to overpromise and underdeliver. And the answer to sort of getting people off planes and onto trains is building more railways. It's really sort of quite discouraging when you look at what we've done when you compare us to other countries like France, like Spain, like Germany, name any country in Europe and they've probably got a better rail service than we do. It's probably cheaper, it's probably more efficient, it's probably more frequent, and it's probably more reliable. And that comes down to, the handing out of contracts to, the likes of Avanti, who have run services into the ground while creaming profit off the top. So I know we've sort of segued back into trains here, but the answer to stopping people getting on planes is very much trains, particularly for domestic flights. Obviously, there are some places like if you need a flight to Belfast, you might struggle to get a train there, but it is trying to incentivise people to do the thing that's more environmentally friendly. And actually, in the grand scheme of things, if you were to try and get a flight from Manchester to London, by the time you were to get, obviously not from here, but if you live, half an hour, 45 minutes away from the airport, by the time you get there, go through security, get from whichever airport you're landing in London, it's not actually much difference than if you actually got the train. But the problem is as well, the price of those flights is often quite cheaper than rail. I went up to Edinburgh a few weekends back to see Taylor Swift. I took a train. Both me and my friend went. There was two of us, and we both had rail cards to get a third off. The combined ticket price was, it would have been £160 for the two of us. A tank of petrol in a car is way less than that. So it's this incentives to get
talking
people.
About getting the pricing mechanism.
Yeah, right. And we know, the trains at the moment are eye-wateringly expensive compared to places across Europe. So having a train service and system that's fairly priced, that works for people, is how we stop that.
Thank you. So if we move on to thinking about retrofitting. You mentioned retrofitting electric charging into homes, but the bigger challenge really is retrofitting homes. And I was going to say, if you take us through what your policies would be on that, or how you think we could tackle this major issue that we have in terms of our leaky homes.
Yes, it starts by, it's sort of two-pronged again on this, isn't it? You've got the insulation side of things and making sure that we use less energy in the first instance, but also making sure that homes can generate their own energy too. We've said we want to see a solar panel revolution, which actually gives people back those feeder tariffs and makes it attractive and incentivises people to have solar. Obviously, the cost of such schemes have come down massively in recent years. So that's part of it. I think trying to encourage and incentivise businesses too. It's not just about residential housing, it's about businesses too, making sure that they try to decarbonise. If you drive anywhere along the A1 or the M62, you see warehouse after warehouse of effectively a sea of sort of steel and metal, which, if it had been thinking and incentivised to sort of cover those in solar panels, it would have been a real good opportunity to reduce people's energy dependency on conventional methods and fossil fuels. On the insulation side of things, we've said we want to see a multi-100 million pound package to insulate homes and make sure that they're fit for purpose. Obviously, that helps massively with the cost of living to the people who might be on lower incomes. We need to see a government scheme that's rolled out to facilitate that sort of straight away. We obviously used to have more schemes back when we were in government in the coalition. Things like the Green Investment Bank, we saw a quadrupling of offshore wind, but sort of those green policies have sort of been missing in recent years and have fallen by the wayside. I think who who said they wanted to cut the green pact? Was it David Cameron who came out with that in the end? And we're seeing the impact of that now when it comes to people's household bills, when it comes to reliance on fossil fuels. So again, we've in our manifesto got a fairly broad and comprehensive offer on that. And we've said we want to see that funded by taxing the oil and gas giants that are making record-breaking profits even now still. I think we were the first party out of the gates a couple of summers back calling for a windfall tax on those companies, and then Conservatives implemented a half-hearted one with loads of sort of opt-outs and loopholes, which just wasn't really fit for purpose.
So in your manifesto, you talk about, for some of the retrofit work being delegated to local councils. Yes. And I appreciate that as Democrats, that's what you think is the right route. How do you think that would work out working with North Yorkshire Council, just in our local context?
Local councils have already got all the infrastructure in place to deal with sort of grant schemes, funding mechanisms. What we need to see is a massive scaling up of the abilities of local councils to be able to implement retrofitting and insulation and other schemes too. I don't think it will be easy by any stretch of imagination, but again, that partly comes down to skills as well. There's no reason that places like Harrogate College couldn't be upskilling the next generation of people who might be dealing with retrofitting and green tech too.
Interestingly, in our experience with our retrofit project, it's not so much the skills of young people coming through, it's the existing workforce who are the majority of the workforce who need to be encouraged to retrain or to upskill in terms of retrofit, and that's a major challenge.
No, absolutely. I was going to say, and again, it's sort of how do you sort of try to encourage that rather than punish. I think that's definitely the way it needs to be. It needs to be seen as a benefit, and it needs to sort of, add and complement rather than detract from what people have been doing. I think as well, what I would say is, in terms of sort of retrofitting, it's also a case of we need to retrofit, but it's also making sure we don't need to retrofit in future and building quality homes that are up to the spec for future generations and future decades. So ideally, we shouldn't be having this conversation in 10, 20 years. If we've been ambitious.
And in terms of new homes, would that be a a planning route or a building regs route, or
I think it's got to be both.
and,
I think
or-
it's got to be both. What we have seen is where the government nationally have increased sort of the sort of bare minimum what people should be doing and developers should be putting in new housing, is they still do the bare minimum. So there's loads of people now who I know who've bought houses, gone, oh, it's got an EV charging point, great, I can buy an EV car. And then they realise that the EV charging point that's been put in will probably take a week to charge a car because it's one that's not fit for purpose. And that's because the developers go, oh, we must put in an EV charging point. Let's get the cheapest one that's not fit for purpose to tick the box. And it's about actually regulating to make sure that they don't keep making shoddy decisions. And the same, sort of, to me, one of the biggest scandals is that, you know, when you're looking at housing these days, you barely see any that comes with solar built in already on the roofs. That should be something that is just baked in going forward. But for, you know, for whatever reason, that's just not happening. I think developers are prioritising profits over planet themselves, and don't really see the benefit, or, you know, they don't see any need on their part to do their bit. And again, I think that's going to be down to national government sort of incentivising and, you know, having a bit of a firmer hand with the developers. And again, you sort of see one of the biggest complaints we see is on particularly new build estates, is that the developers don't put in the infrastructure that they promise. You can go around some housing sites where people have been living 2-3 years and the roads still aren't done, the sewage isn't working and isn't connected, the drainage, and that you end up with all these glossy brochures and leaflets of how we're embedding nature and wildlife throughout these developments, and you end up with some half-dead twigs in the ground that they then won't replace. And again, really sort of greening all our environment, particularly with new build housing or new build space in town too, when we're sort of repurposing office blocks that now might be residential. It's about making all of our communities, whether it's urban or suburban, more greener and using nature to combat the climate issues that we see. We know that if you plant trees, streets which have trees are cooler, trying to make sure that we sort of have a thread of green thinking throughout everything in planning going forward.
Thank you, Tom, because you brought us on to my next question, really, was about adaptation.
Yeah.
Because, as you say, I mean, our climate has changed. We're feeling the impacts of that in a multitude of different ways right across the economy, and impacting, obviously, more with some of our neighbours globally, but actually people are feeling it here too. So again, you know, just if any comments or policies that you would like to see to help us with that adaptation.
Yeah, like I say, I think we need to sort of quite clearly embed sort of nature solutions to these problems throughout every aspect of planning decisions when it comes to sort of local planning. One of the other things that we've said as a party that's in our manifesto is, forget the exact wording of it, but like a chief secretary to the Treasury for sustainability, and having that thread throughout everything government does in terms of how could, you know, what environmental impacts will this have, and how could we mitigate or, you know, try to produce something that's more beneficial for the environment through it. And it's got to be that sort of common green thread throughout all policy. The other thing that I would say too is this sort of adapting to the world as it now is, as well, is we need to restore our commitment to 0.7% of GDP for overseas international development and aid. You know, one of the things that I find quite sort of sad, really, is that this election has been attacked and fought from people on the right of the political spectrum trying to make it about immigration. Well, there's lots of people who are displaced, and that's down to climate issues, whether it be flooding, whether it be famine, whether it be drought, and we're going to see more of that. So actually providing aid and trying to mitigate the effects of climate in the countries where they're already experiencing a climate catastrophe is what we need to do, and that should be, you know, that's a moral obligation too for us as a society, particularly when, you know, we were the ones who were first on the industrial revolution, pumping out record levels of CO2 and such.
Yeah, so there's a historic justice issue.
But again, it's, you know, it's again this sort of pragmatic approach, isn't it? Like, if we don't act now, you know, we're already going to see the effects of rising sea levels, of changing climates. You know, we're not immune to that. You know, we're an island. We will very much see the impacts of rising sea levels if we don't act. And I think trying to make sure that we do what's, like I say, morally and ethically right, but also benefits the world as a whole. It's, you know, we should be trying to seek to do more. And again, it's sort of in a similar situation, what we've seen with the immigration debate in the broadest context is that if we don't try and help people, then they are displaced, and then the impact will reach us, but just in a different way to if we'd acted sooner.
Yeah. Okay. Tim, over to you. As well.
Right. This is a question I haven't asked anyone else, but I'll ask it a few times. You're in an interesting position of having a very good chance of being elected and virtually a nil chance of being part of the next government. So what does success, let's assume, big assumption, but let's assume you get elected. What does success over the next 5 years look like?
So this is a question that I've had come up a few times where people have gone, oh, well, if you're not in government, you can't do anything. That's fundamentally not true. We obviously used to have Phil Willis as the MP, who did a heck of a lot for the area, for the towns and villages. I think what we need to see is actually, if we do, as the polls are sort of predicting, end up with a Labour government, it's trying to pull them to the left to address the issues on the environment, on sort of fairness and justice, and trying to make sure there's a compassionate thread to it. So it's sort of, in the same way, I would say one of the biggest political actors of the last few decades has been Nigel Farage, pulling the entire debate to immigration and to the right. We need to be the sort of counterbalance to that on the environment and on progressive issues. And we do that by having more MPs in Parliament and by using the opportunity to get, should we be elected, to frame that debate and have that conversation. You've only got to look at some of the achievements in the last Parliament from Lib Dem MPs who aren't in government, whether it be things like Wendy Chamberlain's Carers Leave Bill, giving people guaranteed time off work to look after loved ones. We can have an impact. And credit where credit's due. I think, there's been one Green MP in the last decade, and she's done a heck of a lot to raise the profile of climate change and the climate emergency. So, to me, like I say, as a party, I think we're, broadly speaking, one of the better parties when it comes to climate, when it comes to sort of green issues. And I would expect us to be dragging that conversation to the Labour Party, should they be in government themselves.
Okay. And what, if you were elected, would you see our role, as just as constituents and as a vocal, pro-climate action charity in working with you?
Yeah, well, one of the things that one of the opponents in the election has been saying, I agree wholeheartedly with. They keep talking about the role of the MP is to be a convener, someone who brings people together and connects the dots, and that's very much the way that I see it too. When we had the Chamber of Commerce business hustings, again, I was saying that, should I be elected, then having a commitment to meet with and try to represent the business community and the issues that they're facing is something that I would do. And again, that would be the same with other community organisations, whether it be Zero Carbon Harrogate, whether it be Harrogate Civic Society. The MP should be someone who's embedded in all those different groups and can be their voice and raise the issues that is pertinent to them. So I'd absolutely, sort of be committed to doing that. And again, that's regardless of political persuasion or people's personal views. The MP as a role is meant to be someone who tries to sort of find that consensus and work with, rather than just sort of endlessly shout down other people that they disagree with.
Right. And in addition to that, how would you want us to hold you accountable for?
I think it's about, when there's opportunities that might arise in Parliament, whether it be a debate or whether it be a government sort of, a plan, it's about sort of speaking to people on the ground about how it could be improved, and what they would expect to see from a good piece of legislation, or, in terms of sort of how we can refine things and put that to, politicians love to steal good ideas. So if we can come up with them, I have absolutely no problem with other parties or, the government of the day stealing a good idea and running with it. And it's not about getting the glory, it's about getting the job done. And by working with people like yourselves, who feed into that, whether it be through APPGs or party parliamentary groups, whether it be through backbench debates, whether it be through things like King's speeches, whether it be through budget debates, making sure we highlight those issues and give the government of the day those ideas to run with.
Right. Okay. Well, perhaps when we finish, we can get your diary out and book you for next year to come and talk to us again, and you can tell us about your first year.
Well, fingers crossed. We're not taking anything for granted.
Of course not.
Still a long way to go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That's been a most interesting and wide-ranging conversation. Thank you for watching, and do use your vote on the 4th of July.